You're listening to the Big Cast, your source for the latest in financial technology. Brought to you weekly by the Best Innovation Group, with your hosts, John Best and Glenn Sarvati.
Welcome to another edition of the Big Cast. My name is Glenn Sarvati on behalf of the Best Innovation Group, where we like to do cool things with financial technology. We've got a great interview today with Claire Green, one of our friends from the Atlanta Fed, and someone responsible for a really valuable piece of research that they put out on a regular basis, both the survey and the diary of consumer payment choice. You'll get a better sense of what those two are about when we get into this conversation with Claire. A lot of great insights that can help inform the approach that credit unions and anybody else in the fintech space wants to take to the consumer payment experience. So we'll be getting into that in just a bit. Want to remind you, as always, you can find out more about the Best Innovation Group by checking out our website, big-fintech.com. Also want to remind you about our town halls. Just last week, we had a great one, really digging into a slightly different angle, the use of AI to close the gap in various disability situations, neurological challenges, things along those lines. Got pretty heady at times and pretty poignant at times as well. But always, as John Best does a great job with this, kind of cycling it back to how can this be applied to the credit union space. And one of the things we also brought up in that context was Java for Kids, a new effort selling coffee with a $5 donation with each bag going to the credit unions for kids hospital initiative that's been part of America's credit unions and the credit union leagues for some time, from our friends at Typhone who have pulled that one together. We've got a link to that at our website, and I'll also have it in the show notes for this episode as well, so you can track that down there. Definitely a worthwhile cause I think you should check out. I want to also mention the next episode of the Town Hall will be taking place on Wednesday, August 7th. You can get an invitation to that one. It's free to join, but you do need to register in advance. cutownhall.com is the best way to do that. You can also find replays of past episodes there. We started getting into this conversation briefly in this past episode, or past session that we met up with, around the notion of a primary financial institution, and whether that whole concept still really applies in a world where money is flying back and forth. Even I've been a big proponent for some time that wherever you have your direct deposit linked is your primary financial institution. I still believe that to be the case. But the point came up that a lot of people just have automatic transfers that just are set up to take it in and shoot it right back out. So if you never actually touch the money there, is it still primary? It's an interesting question, and I think it's worth something we'll be checking into. And if you have any thoughts about that in advance, please do drop us a note. You can do that via the website, or you can find me on LinkedIn. And we'll definitely bring that into the conversation, but we like this to be a lively and interactive conversation too. So if you join us, that's 3 p.m. Eastern Time, noon Pacific on Wednesday, August 7th. We would love to have you in the audience, and there's always a giveaway that's kind of involved in that one too that you can check out. Another thing coming up, actually, the very next day after that, on Thursday, August 8th, TrueStage is having their virtual Discovery 2024 conference. It's pretty much a day-long event taking place, as I said, virtually. Another important word to add to that one, it's free. So you can register. We'll have a link to that where you can find out more and also register for that. The agenda's got some really interesting stuff. Our friend Brett King is doing the keynote on something he calls the CU 5.0 blueprint and uniting for progress. Brett's a great futurist, and I can't wait to see how he's taken that one. And I also want to know what happened to CU 3.0 and 4.0. I'm not sure I can point to those. We have our friends at CU 2.0 out there as well. So he's moved the meter forward a couple notches, and I'm kind of curious what he's thinking along those lines. Ronaldo Hardy, another friend of ours who's been on the podcast before, and he's no longer new, but the head of Nacuso, but taking a different perspective. He's been in the credit union space for some time, but as he points out, taking a new set of eyes and envisioning credit unions through a new perspective. So I'd be very curious now that he's had about a year, I guess, in that seat to see exactly how he's thinking about that. And I'm only just rattling off a couple of the highlights that caught my attention. There's another panel discussion about demystifying digital transformation, which is always a hot topic. The thing that I like particularly about this one is the participants. There are 2 credit union executives in the data and strategy space, Always important to have that perspective. But on top of that, Maya Mihailov, who is the CEO and co-founder of Savvy AI, we've spoken to her in the past. Very insightful woman. I think she'll have a great perspective on that one. And another friend of the podcast, Lamont Black, a PhD and a professor in fintech and a blockchain proponent out at DePaul University. So that promises to be, and none of them are shy with their opinions. So I'm very interested to see where that one goes. As I said, that's on Thursday, August 8th. Our sponsors and friends at TrueStage are putting that one on, and you can go out to the TrueStage website directly, but you can also just go and check the link out at the Best Innovation Group website or the show notes that we've got along with this episode, wherever you're listening, whether it's on the podcast, on the Best Innovation Group website, Apple Music, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, your neighbor's tin can that runs a wire down to the street. But however you get this, you can check it out that way. Last week, I was surprised by woke up one morning, picked up, yes, I still do get the paper edition of the New York Times, and the main story in the business section with a large drawing. I wouldn't even call it a photograph. It was kind of a intentionally kind of primitive looking drawing on a story called Why Paper Checks Refuse to Die. And I thought, okay, here we go again. Another hit piece, why checks suck and why they have to go away, and isn't it a pain that we still have them, and blah, blah, blah. So I'm kind of bracing myself. And it, if you take a look at the photo, you kind of get that impression that's where it's going, because there is this rather crudely drawn dinosaur walking across the page with a check tucked under its arm. So it's okay. I can kind of see where this one's going. Well, it didn't. It went in a very different direction that I was quite surprised by, because so many of these conversations you hear, the check is a dinosaur, it died long ago. Gee, why do we still have them? And when they discover that people are still writing them, they laid out a bunch of reasons and I thought it was written almost in a defense of checks kind of approach, saying this is why we still got them and this is why they're still useful. They weren't writing it from a perspective of, and they need to go away. It's like, if you want them to go away, you better solve these problems. One quote that I took out of there was, for every person who's a victim of check fraud, there's another one who runs into crooks online. And given the press that you see around Zelle fraud and things like that, hard to argue with that one. They then made a bunch of other arguments, just consumer choice, simplicity, not needing to dork out. I think they use that phrase, dorking out on how to actually accept payments for situations like small business, but they also specifically pointed out to like HOA, condo associations. It's like someone volunteers for a position and has to track down money. They don't want to learn a whole new platform to make that happen. They just want to do it the simplest way. Now, maybe that comes out to be Venmo, but you got an audit trail problem or mingling of funds. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of reasons, including surcharges, as they pointed out. You could certainly argue that maybe checks ought to be subject to some more nuisance fees if you want to do that, but you do see surcharges often about using your card online. Typically, if you put the check in the mail, yeah, you may pay a postage stamp, but it's probably less than the surcharge you're going to pay for using a card. New York Times article, as I said, very surprising to me, very interesting, and I'll post a link to that one as well in the show notes so you can check that out. And that kind of ties into some of the conversation about the way people actually consume payments and how they wind up using these different opportunities. And that's the crux of the survey and diary of consumer payment choice. Regular listeners are probably aware I'm a big fan of the research that the Federal Reserve puts out on this stuff, and spent a lot of time dorking out, for lack of a better expression, with Claire Green on this stuff. So I was very happy that she was willing to step back and have a conversation about what they found out of here and a couple of pieces of research that they put out, and a good data set that you can pretty much dig into, roll up your sleeves, and do it yourself. Anyway, let's have a listen. I'm here with Claire Green from I believe we say the Atlanta Fed, right, Claire, even though you sit in Boston?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, it's very confusing, but she's a payments expert with the Federal Reserve, and somebody that I've gotten to know quite well over the course of the last several years, and does a great bit of research and is responsible for one of my favorite pieces of ongoing research that the Fed does, the Survey and Diary of Consumer Payments Choice. And they've put out some new research recently that I thought was definitely worthy of taking additional dive into. So Claire, thanks for agreeing to take some time to go into that.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk about what we human beings decide to do in different situations.
Let me also mention right up front too, Claire is also one of the main authors, I'd say the most prolific author for the Take on Payments blog that is put out by the Retail Risk Payments Forum from the Fed, that you post, somebody posts a new blog post every Monday, and that's quite often you. And it's one of my favorite go-tos. So I think if people are not looking at that, I'd like to encourage folks, and you wind up getting information kind of drawn from these types of data sets.
Thanks for saying that. It is fun to pick out little bits and pieces of the more complex research and call them out to people.
So the diary, and again, the official title says it well, consumer payment choice. So we're talking purely about consumer payments, and we actually are going to the source. We're not like doing tallies in the back office. We are actually polling the consumers themselves about how they make their payments. You've been gathering this data now for how many years? Going on a decade?
It's getting close to 15 years.
Wow.
For both the survey and the diary combined. And our goal with this research is to, understand, let's say, the end user, one aspect of the end users of the payment system, and learning more about how consumers make choices can help inform product design, the Fed's own internal planning for its payments processing, for example, what kind of infrastructure is needed to support cash processing, can inform consumer protection and consumer education. And there are representative surveys of US consumers age 18 and older. And we do look into three very broad areas of payments. So the first is what we consumers think about payments. Do we think they're safe, convenient, low cost? So we ask these questions for all different payment instruments. And then second, what we have when it comes time to pay. For example, do I have any cash in my wallet? Do I have a debit card? Am I set up for a P2P payment app? And then finally, third, what we do in particular situations. And we do look at all the different reasons a person might make a payment. So purchases, bills, paying another person, and also, say, a transfer between a bank account to maybe an investment account or something like that.
And you also break things out by age cohort. You break things out by income level, and obviously, there's those are both pretty big drivers of behavior. So it's interesting to see how they split up over those dimensions as well. And then there's the survey, and then there's also the diary, which gets really granular, right? Is it what, for a 3-day period? You ask people to pretty much log every single individual payment they make?
Exactly. So we have a panel of about 5,000 people, and they report for the diary in October of every year. And on every day of October, a different group subset of those 5,000 people start recording all the payments they make over a 3-day period. And the statistician on our team makes sure that those groups are similar to each other based on the various demographic characteristics, as you mentioned, income, also age, education, race, ethnicity, household size. There's a lot of components there. And then we really do get down into the weeds about the kind of payments you might make. So for example, Glenn, when you go out to buy your coffee in the morning, you would tell us the time of your payment, the date, the payment instrument you used, how much you paid, whether or not you used a device, and whether or not you were remote or in person for your coffee. I would assume you would be in person. And then also the type of merchant you paid, for example, in this instance, a fast food purveyor. And depending upon the different answers you give, we might ask you a couple of follow-up questions. For example, if you told us that you prefer to use a credit card whenever you're making an in-person purchase, and then you happen to buy your coffee with cash, we might ask you, you told us you like to use a credit card, why are you using cash? And people might say, because of the dollar value, because I always do it this way, because I think it's more convenient in this instance. So we do have a pretty rich set of information about what people do.
And you're starting to get into some of the things that really jumped out at me when I looked at the numbers. So let's kind of get into that right now. One of the things, I think the headlines that I see is, cards keep marching along, and particularly credit card. When you look, and we've talked about this a bit before we started recording, the number of transactions that the average person reports making at this point in a given month has reached an all-time high. It had fallen for a while during the pandemic for, I think, fairly obvious reasons. And we have now exceeded the number even pre-pandemic. And the growth is almost entirely on debit and credit transactions.
That's great. And I think I'd like to talk about the card transactions in two different contexts. So the first thing is just the form factor, the fact that a card is either a piece of plastic or something that's stored in your mobile wallet or in a mobile app.
And for the purposes of your measurement, even if it's stored in the wallet or the app, it's still being called a card transaction.
It is called a card transaction. So people might say they might choose, I made a mobile payment. You know, we have to translate behind what our respondent might be thinking about things to what we are trying to learn.
They don't speak the language, the geeky language we do of payment speak.
Exactly. So if a person says I made a mobile payment, we'll say, well, how was that mobile payment funded? Just for example. So, you know, the card format is something, I think some of the growth we see in cards is because of the format and is really built upon the growth in mobile pay.
That's a good point.
And then the second part, of course, is that credit cards are different from the other kind of cards in that they are a loan. And so people use credit cards possibly because of the card format, but also because they want either a short-term loan before they're going to pay off their card in full, or, you know, they're carrying a balance in order to smooth out their family finances.
Now, I know you're also taking a look on whether people are revolvers or if they're transactors in terms of paying off their bill every month, and that affects behavior as well, right?
You're right. Credit cards are very different products depending upon if a person is a revolver or a person who pays in full every month. For a person who pays in full every month and receives rewards, that person might rate credit cards as a low-cost payment method because essentially that person's getting a discount on their purchases. For a person who is carrying a balance and is going to start paying interest from the moment a payment is made with the credit card, that might become a high-cost payment instrument.
I think you've also mentioned, I mean, some of this obviously comes down to ability to pay. And I believe that transactors skew much more toward the higher income brackets, correct?
Yes, that's right. I think about 60% of transactors have household income above $75,000 a year, and that's compared to just about 46% of revolvers. Revolvers also tend to carry more types of other debt, whether that's a mortgage or auto loan debt or education debt.
One of the other things I noticed that I thought was really kind of striking was the story of the death of cash. And I know we've talked about this before. The decline in cash seems to have really slowed. I mean, I think obviously when people are not, the only place you can really use cash is if you're transacting in person. So there's a trend toward more remote payments in the first place, which is going to work against it. But the number of cash transactions the typical person makes in a month is pretty much flatlined over the course of the last few years, from what I can tell.
That is correct. So I think we really can't underestimate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic for so many aspects of our lives. And that, of course, does include payments. And we did see during COVID, a decline in in-person payments and resulting decline in cash payments. It's also the case, though, that consumer habits are incredibly slow to change, and people do see utility in using cash. In our survey, we found out that 9 out of 10 consumers had used cash at least once in the prior 30 days.
And that's by far, I shouldn't say by far, but that is still the most commonly used instrument. As I remember looking, I think I jotted it down here, the second most commonly used instrument, 73% of people have used a credit card in the last 30, and debit was actually lower than credit, which kind of surprised me.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And the other thing you see about cash is that, in research using this data, we do find that consumers' assessments of the various qualities, for example, low cost and convenience of payment instruments, is important for their decision making. And consumers do continue to rank cash as the best, both for cost of using it and also for ease of obtaining it. We also
go ahead.
ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say, I thought it was interesting that also not only are still 90%, almost 90% of consumers using it at some point, there was also a piece that I saw that I guess you asked 90% have no plans to stop using it either. So the idea that suddenly people are going to go cold turkey doesn't seem to be holding water.
Right. We did ask people, did they think it would be problematic if the so-called cashless society came to exist? And about 2/3 of people either said it was a big problem or just couldn't figure out how to imagine it. And their answers had to do with cash as a backup payment method when other payments are refused. People mentioned power failures and other emergencies. And many people do still rely on cash as a budgeting tool. The old-fashioned sort of envelope budgeting that our grandparents or great-grandparents might have used, where, once the envelope is empty, you don't spend any more until you get paid.
Yeah, I found another point that I thought was interesting. And you kind of referred to this a little bit before about your coffee example of using cash, that nearly 3/4 of the cash payments were made by consumers who elsewhere have stated that they prefer using cards. So they've expressed a preference for using cards, but they're still pulling cash out at some point.
This is a really interesting aspect of survey research, which is what I tell you I will do versus what I actually do. So, for example, it's 11:30 here in Massachusetts, and so if you were to say to me, "Are you planning to have a chocolate chip cookie after lunch?" I would say, "Oh no, not me." But if you ask me again at 3 o'clock, my answer might be different.
No, we wouldn't even ask intent. When you actually filled out the diary of what you ate, you'd say, "Oh yeah, I had a cookie." Right?
Yes, exactly.
I think that's a really telling point. I think that, and again, the intent, and that's why I think so much of the survey and the diary kind of reinforcing one another is so important. The other thing I thought was interesting is the places that cash is most commonly used. It looked to me like almost half of the cash that's still being used is at restaurants and bars, grocery and convenience stores.
Yes. And I think another thing you see in the diary is that all of us we make a lot of payments for food.
Yeah.
Whether it's fast food, at the grocery store, at restaurants and bars. When you look at the share of payments by number in those categories, it's, quite significant.
I know you and I can talk about this stuff all day, but I want to get to one more point here that I thought was really, kind of real current events right now around buy now, pay later. And you've asked, I think that's one of those things. Obviously, that was not something you were asking about 15 years ago in the survey. So you obviously are updating the survey to, speak to the most recent trends. It looks like awareness of buy now, pay later offerings is up to about 75% from what I saw from the most recent. And this is 2023 data, right? October of 20.
Yes. October 2023. So you're right. We started asking about buy now, pay later in 2021. So we have 3 years of data, and people certainly have heard of it. And in the prior 30 days, about half of consumers reported that they had received an offer to use buy now, pay later. So it's becoming more and more common to see it.
So you see it, and then I think what I saw was that in overall, having accepted an offer in the last 30 days was 9%. So that's roughly 1/5 of the people who actually received the offer.
Yes.
And presumably that means if that's only 30 days, that means that the number of people overall who are using it is probably well over 10%.
Well, I can't speculate on that.
Yeah.
Because I think an interesting question is how incidents of use, like do you use it once in the prior 12 months, and in which case maybe there would be a lot of people versus is there a core group of, people who are using it more often?
And obviously there's a much more of a tail on that one. We were just discussing that, new news is breaking that Chase is no longer going to allow their credit cards to be used to make installment payments on buy now, pay later, effective in October. So, but at the same time, Chase offers their own pay in 4 solution. So it's going to get interesting out there. And Apple Pay's obviously struck some new deals in that space as well. So it's amazing that, there's always looking to the next cycle, but you'll be back in market with another one of these surveys, I guess, in just another 2-3 months.
Yes, that's correct. We're working on what sorts of updates we might want to make to our questions based on current developments right now.
I was going to say, other than fine tuning, buy now, pay later is obviously the hottest topic I can think, or maybe instant payments, but the consumer doesn't say, hey, I'm going to make a Fed Now payment or an RTP payment. Any thoughts of maybe measuring that in some fashion, or is that something that's more
having a lot of conversations about how to get at this exact question, how to help the consumer, just for example, understand what we're asking about. An analogy to the past is our definition of cash is, I think, 4 or 5 words, and our definition of a prepaid card is 120 words.
Somehow I'm not surprised, but that's a good perspective.
Yes. So I think the thing with instant payments that I think about is product design, because it's like you said, it's a bank-to-bank product, or it's a bank-to-bank facility. So it isn't something that the consumer is going to directly see, but maybe the consumer could answer a question like, were you offered an opportunity to make this payment go faster? Or did you pay a fee to make this payment go faster, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But these are lovely hypothetical questions, but it's important to remember that we have a limited amount of time for 2 reasons. Certainly, we pay by the amount of minutes our respondents spend answering our surveys, but also people can get tired.
Oh, survey fatigue. Yeah, you don't want them dropping out. Exactly. You almost have to find something that you stop asking if you want to add something. The other one that comes to my mind, which not yet, but probably in the next couple of years, something around the pay by bank solution, which is probably just as complicated to try to explain to the consumer what it is you're really asking.
Exactly, because people think they already do that.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Well, Claire, as always, this is great. Again, I want to mention, and you're taking on the most recent topics in the Take on Payments blog posts every Monday. So I think that I've noticed already that you use a lot of this data to support like your latest kind of conclusions and hypotheses, and really reflecting on the hot topics. I know you've got something out there on, I think, buy now, pay later right now.
That's right. And also earned wage access.
That's the other one. Exactly. That's that, which I guess goes the other way. That's getting paid, not paying. So it's not one necessarily for this survey, but obviously a very interesting topic. So we will post links to the Take on Payments blog and a couple of both papers that both the one that goes directly to the survey, and then another one it's the San Francisco office that really focuses on cash, and they really dug down deeper on the specific cash aspects that come out of this. So what the best way is to make sure that people are up to date on the latest releases, probably the blog.
That is definitely a good way. And you can also sign up for updates on consumer data releases at atlantafed.org.
Wonderful. Claire Green, risk payments expert at the Atlanta Fed. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Can't wait for the next release so we can talk about it some more.
Thanks, Glenn. Great to chat with you.
So thanks again to Claire for taking the time. Show notes, as I can't stress often enough, because I love to provide further resources for people to dig in further if they are so inclined. We've got the link to her specific written article about the findings from the survey. Also have one from, I guess it's technically from Federal Reserve Financial Services, but the cash office out in San Francisco. There's a lot of stuff about cash. And as we talked about, cash ain't going away either, much like paper checks. There's a lot of detail on exactly how people are still using cash, which if you're a fintech is probably a good place to say, okay, that's why it's still there. Let's see if we can solve those pain points and figure out how to make that happen. We got a link to that one, as well as a link to the data more broadly of the survey itself. As I say, the Fed does a really good job of making that available for people to analyze and interrogate as they see fit. With that, another episode of the Big Cast in the books. Remind you again, as I did earlier, next week, Wednesday, August 7th, the next town hall coming up on behalf of the Best Innovation Group and our friends at CU Broadcast, cutownhall.com if you want to register. Free registration, but you do need to register in advance. And then we talked also about the True Stage Discovery 2024 conference that following day, full day Thursday, August 8th. That is free to attend, and we got the link to that one out there as well. on the media tab along with this, or wherever you get your podcasts. Wherever you get us includes hopefully LinkedIn and Twitter and X and all that good stuff. You can find me out there via my firm 154 Advisors or on LinkedIn. Again, my name is Glenn Sarvati. You'll find the Best Innovation Group out there at Big FinTech, or our Grand Poobah John Best at JB FinTech. The website, big-fintech.com. We've got some great stuff already lined up for you next week. We have new content here every Tuesday. If you don't already, we'd appreciate if you would subscribe, like, whatever you do to engage with podcasts at the channel of your choice. And as always, we thank you for listening.
Check back each week for the latest from the Big Cast. Or better yet, we hope you'll consider subscribing for free via Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Tweet us at Big FinTech, email info@big-fintech.com, or visit us at big-fintech.com and click on the Media tab, where you can post a comment or check out our archive of hundreds of past episodes. See you next week.